Welcome back to our course on conflict of interest for professionals. In this module, we will discuss ways to deal with the conflict of interest. I want you to take a few moments now to think about how you have dealt with conflicts of interest in the past yourself. Do you have a real plan? Or do you just wing it on a case-by-case basis? What if you do find that you have a conflict of interest? Well, some immediate actions are let other people know you have a conflict of interest. Withdraw from the assignment if possible. Note that this might not be possible if you work in a small company or have special expertise that no one else has. And until there is a plan in place to deal with the conflict, refrain from discussing the issue with decision makers, voting in any way, or even advising. Note also that you have a right to privacy too. Thus, you should only need to disclose the bare minimum personal information related to your conflict. Now, these are personal actions to take, but what can organizations do to manage conflict of interest? One solution used by a range of governments are sunshine laws. Sunshine laws are laws requiring transparency and disclosure in government. They are meant to prove that the decisions are objective and not unduly favoring or influenced by any one party. In North America, environment and labor laws, amongst others, are subject to such laws that require the proposing department to make their case for any changes. The departments must show that benefit exceeds cost, and even if some people benefit more than others, it is still the right decision. While mostly used by governments, the concept can be adapted to use for private industry. As an example of sunshine laws in action, we can look at a recent proposal to change the training regime with regards to the transportation of dangerous goods. In essence, the government was saying that the current training scheme was not resulting in workers being trained to an adequate level. So, after consultation, Transport Canada put forth their case for a new training scheme in the Canada Gazette, the official record of government actions. As you can see in the highlighted excerpt from the Canada Gazette, Transport Canada concluded that the cost of the proposal was $15.79 million in extra training. But the proposal would save $17.43 million in avoided accident costs, for a net benefit of $1.63 million, and avoiding 2 deaths and 88 injuries. Thus, the regulation would have a net positive effect on Canada. Do such disclosures give you more confidence that there were no backroom deals being made regarding this proposal? And how many of your decisions are so quantifiable that you could do a similar analysis? There are, of course, other ways to handle conflict of interest. Returning to our study of solutions used by several developed countries, we see declining gifts is at the top. Second and third place options, sell personal interests or resign, are more harsh. Like other issues that must be managed, though, I suggest that a progressive approach is more effective. One such approach is the 6 R's. Register the interests. Reassign the conflicted person. Recruit an independent person to oversee the project. Replace the conflicted person in their position. Relinquish whatever the issue or situation is causing the conflict. Or resign. Although often not as structured as this, these strategies are common in many conflict of interest policies. I will go through each in turn. The first option is to register or disclose your interests. If, after disclosure, everyone is okay with your continuing, then proceed with the project. Note that we will discuss disclosure in more detail in the next module. But for now, we can note that registration or disclosure is best for very low risk and potential conflicts of interest, and is a good response where the act of transparency through disclosing conflicts is sufficient. That said, you should realize that registration does not in itself resolve the conflict. The conflict is still there. If simple registration is not sufficient, the next step is recusal or reassignment. Essentially, the conflicted person keeps the same job, but just works on a different project. This option works best when the conflicted person can be effectively separated from the parts of the activity or process causing the conflict. As such, recusals are often disruptive. This option is not very good if the conflicted person must be frequently reassigned. On the issue of recusal, consider this. The Prime Minister or President is the supreme authority in most governments and oversees all operations. Is it practical for Prime Ministers or Presidents to recuse themselves anytime anything affecting them personally arises? The issue here is frequent recusals would be required, which would undermine the Prime Minister or President's ability to function. Thus, some other solution must be found. The next option is recruiting an independent person to oversee the project, or parts of the project that are causing the conflict. This option works best when the potential effects or the perceived effects of the conflict are more significant and require more serious management. And you cannot entirely remove the conflicted person from the decision-making process because, for instance, they have a particular expertise that is necessary and not easily replaced. A practical issue is where one finds such independent people who have both time on their hands and enough subject matter knowledge to make useful decisions. Although not used often, this strategy does address many common conflict of interest situations. Getting more serious now, if the previous methods do not work, the conflicted person can be transferred to a job where the conflict of interest would not arise. Note that this is a permanent transfer and may have significant costs to the conflicted person in terms of pay, prestige, job satisfaction, and a host of other aspects. Getting even more serious now, the conflicted person can relinquish whatever was the source of the conflict of interest. This can mean selling shares in a business through a forced sale, or resigning from your favorite clubs, or withdrawing from a church, or even divorcing a spouse. Like I said, serious. Such measures may also discourage good people from taking on assignments, for fear that such measures would be used against them. For that reason, this option is rarely recommended for low-risk situations. One option to make relinquishment less harsh is a blind trust. In a blind trust, the trustee holds legal title to the assets and is empowered to administer the assets without any input from the asset's owner. The trustee may not provide the owner with any information about the day-to-day operations of the trust. The idea being that if you cannot see the effect your actions are having on your assets, you are less likely to take actions intended to increase them. Blind trusts are fairly common in elected officials. Now let's talk over a case study. The U.S. president has a dominant impact on the U.S. economy, and thus indirectly on the fortunes of individual companies. As president, Donald Trump was criticized for refusing to place his assets in a blind trust. Was Mr. Trump in a conflict of interest by not placing his assets in a blind trust? Yes, he was. Recalling our definition of conflict of interest from Module 3 and changing it slightly. Conflict of interest exists when the president's duties and responsibilities, such as perhaps raising corporate taxes, are or potentially could be compromised by a desire to advance their personal and private interests. But let's not pretend that the U.S. is alone in these conflicts. While he was the federal finance minister in the 1990s, Paul Martin oversaw several policies that directly affected the shipping industry. Paul Martin's family owns Canada's steamship lines. Now, Martin did put his shares in a blind trust while he was minister. Was Martin still in a conflict of interest? Yes. Even though the trust shielded Martin from day-to-day knowledge, he would be aware of the general impact his policies would have on the profits of a shipping company. So another magical solution bites the dust. Now we move to our final R, resignation. While effective, this is obviously the last resort. So those are our options: registration, reassignment, recruitment, replacement, relinquishment, resignation. Let's work through them in a case study. Assume that you were the director of procurement for a medium-sized company. Your spouse is a maintenance supervisor at a nearby car dealership. Your company wants to buy 20 new cars and 15 new trucks. What, if anything, should you do? Well, the first thing to do is to decide whether you have a conflict of interest. In this case, I would say you have a perceived conflict of interest. The issue that makes it just a perceived conflict is that your spouse is in the maintenance area. If your spouse was a salesperson, they would probably shifted to an actual conflict. But like we've said before, perceived conflict of interest is just as important as real conflict. Okay, so you have a conflict. So let's go through our 6 R's. Registration. Do you think an informed person could think it more likely than not that you would be influenced by your wife's position? First, I would say that such a conclusion would be entirely reasonable. So simple registration or disclosure is not enough. So how about reassignment? This is a major purchase for your company. You are the director of procurement. Is it reasonable that the director of procurement would recuse themselves from such a major purchase? So reassignment is probably not viable. Recruitment. Can you find another senior person in the company to oversee this purchase? Now, this seems like a viable solution. Looking at the last 3 options, I think permanently transferring you to another position is overkill for this one purchase. Similarly, divorce seems a bit excessive. And are you comfortable with quitting altogether over a couple dozen cars? So there we have it. The optimal strategy in this case seems to be recruitment. This concludes our discussion of ways to deal with conflict of interest. I invite you now to move to Module 7, where we will discuss disclosure in more detail.